Les, we're doing a bit of reminiscing here.
Grandfather's grandmother. As you know, our grandfather was born at the back end of the 1800s. I think it was 1894 or 96, I might be wrong. But he was born in Ceylon. And when he got to about 4 or 5, he was sent back from Ceylon to live with his grandmother. This is Margaret Knox, on the farm of Little Anarchy, which is close to Achnagat. And so he would have been brought up on that farm. And I believe the reason that he got into Brownhill, Brunies as it's known as, was that his grandfather and grandmother left a trust, and he got some money from the trust. It actually set him up in Brownhill. I can't quite be sure when he got into Brunies, but in between time, of course, he went off to the war. So in 1915, when he was 21, he joined the reserve battalion of the 5th Battalion of the Gordon Highlanders, along with his brother Fred. And they clearly went off and served in France all the way through to 1918. Armistice was actually my grandfather's birthday, so he must have had a very good birthday present that day when the war stopped. I've often wondered about how he managed to survive all that time, because 5 Gordons had a pretty terrific casualty rate, and in fact, towards the end of the war, they were nearly completely annihilated in March 1918, when the Germans made their final push before they started to lose. And in fact, there was really nothing left of 5 Gordons. It was amalgamated into another battalion. But I was looking at a photograph that we have of him just the other day, in fact. I don't think I've told you this, Jill, but looking at the photograph, I noticed he was wearing spurs and he had a riding crop. And when I started to think about that, I then started to sort of ask the question is, how many horses did an infantry battalion have in the First World War? Well, they nearly had 50 horses. 13 of them would have been riding horses, and the rest would have been heavier horses. So being a farmer, it's probably reasonable to believe that he had a job looking after the horses. And that would have meant that he spent, although the horses would have gone up to the front now and again, but most of the time he would not have been in the front lines looking after the horses, which is probably why he managed to survive in a battalion that nearly lost everyone by the end of the war.
Yeah. What you're looking at, Les, now?
I was looking at his spurs and his riding crop, which is why I think he must have been given the job of looking after horses.
Coming from a farm, as you say, and being a horseman.
Only 13, they would have had about 50 horses, and only 13 were riding horses. So the rest would have been heavy horses for moving the battalion's equipment and for moving stuff from the rear echelons up to the front, or as far forward as they could go with heavy horses in the trenches.
So how many years did he spend in the war?
Well, he went in, he wasn't in the... He hasn't got the 3 medals, because the 3 medals that you get in the First World War, it's Pip, Squeak, and Wilfred, Pip, Squeak, and Wilfred. So he's got 2 of them. So he wasn't there in 1914. He was there in 1915 when they started to expand it quite a lot and raised extra battalions, volunteer battalions. So he went in. So he joined up on his birthday, actually, in October 1915, and then he would have gone to Bedford before being deployed forward into France. So he would have been there for the best part of 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918, and he got demobbed in 1919 in Kinross. Now, I never heard anyone say he ever came home during that time, but maybe he did. maybe he didn't, but it was a long time to be away, and I think he probably must have wondered what it was all about. I did go back to because he was in the 5th Gordons was in most of the major campaigns, so they went through the Somme, they were at Ypres. I did a few years ago went to the start line for the 1917 attack at Ypres, and the thing it just looked like the farmland. You're looking across, just looked like the farmland in Aberdeenshire. You must have thought, what on earth's that about? Because you could see a farm in the distance. It probably wouldn't have been there, but you know, they had one casualty for every yard that they went across the fields. They must have just wondered what that was all about, and what they were doing. And it astounded me because it was so like the the land around Aberdeenshire or whatever. It was just like an ordinary agricultural sort of setting.
But it was far from ordinary.
No, far from ordinary.
Ordinary life is just non-existent at that time, isn't it?
And so I think, well, again, in normal course of events, people would have been getting married at, early on, like early 20s. They didn't get married until 1928. And that's the kind of gap that the war took out of everyone's lives at that time.
Well, when I was thinking about this venture, Les, about doing some video work and trying to capture character people on camera and about not just about the here and now and about their lives at present, but also recollecting things of the past. And I think the more deeply I thought about these connections, I thought, we were just speaking about our grandfather and the difficulties and the perils of war, and we just can't imagine what that would have been like. But I sometimes think that you've got to see life is not just about the here and now, but it's we're on a timeline. I know, and the past, the present, and the future, it's all relevant. So I think if we can take ourselves out and stand back a wee bit from it and think, well, what they did, that's never going to be wasted. Never, ever, ever, ever going to be wasted. And I think, we kind of have to sort of use this material that we're taking at the moment, and the thoughts, the ideas, the things that we've gained in our lives and from the lives of our forefathers. If we can project that into the future, it'll maybe, hopefully, in some way influence, shape the world to come.
However, the only couple of times I remember my grandfather speaking about the First World War, there's only twice I remember him really talking about it when I was small. One was in the back of it. I was in the back of his car, and Jimmy Chalmers was in the front with him, and we were going to Dingwall for some reason. There might have been a sheep sale or some sale at Dingwall. It wasn't the usual Caithness thing, but they were just going as far as Dingwall. And we were driving over the bridge at Pitlourg Station, and my grandfather, you see, now that's just reminded me on something. I said he hadn't been back, or I didn't have any recollection of him or hear him having come back for the war. But he must have come back on leave, because he was talking to Jimmy Chalmers about how upset he was when there were German prisoners working on the station at Pitlourg, and he said they seemed to be having an easy time of it, although they were having to hump stuff, but they were basically they were porters and whatever. And Jimmy Chalmers and him were having a good old sort of nether about how they felt about that. It's interesting that, because I hadn't sort of put that together with him coming home at any time. So the thing that always amazed me about Brunies was where the dog lived, behind the big range and that hole in the wall.
I think that hole in the wall is still there, Les. I think so.
And sometimes because it was nice and warm, sometimes I would crawl in with the dog when I was little, or if I wanted to keep out of the way. But as I say, there was always people coming and going into Brunies. I always remember there used to be a pile of gulls' eggs, and people had been collecting gulls' eggs, and so people were handed out gulls' eggs as they came in. That would have been at a certain time of year. Probably illegal now to take the gulls' eggs, but that was part of the diet. You know, you got gulls' eggs for breakfast in the morning. I also remember there was a big corn kist in the kitchen, and I think this must have been like an early version of energy bars, but I'm sure Bessie, who was my grandfather's second wife, used to kind of pour a porridge or it was like a porridge in the bottom drawer and let it go cold, and then cut a bit of it off to take away with you, and there was just like what you would know as an energy bar now.
I was just thinking, you were saying earlier, Les, that there was a great sense of community, especially on focus times in the farm at Brunies, Hurst.
The harvesting, or when they were sort of thrashing with the moll, everyone would come round. And sheep dipping used to be a sort of community time as well. So people would come around to help with the sheep dipping, and there would always be, well, in these days you had to kind of be overseen by a policeman for some reason, because there was always a policeman there. And I remember being sent after a sheep to catch it, but the sheep got the better of me and I went into the sheep dip, so probably would rush you to the hospital now if you'd gone into
into the dipper.
Into the dipper, but they just hosed me off. And so I used to get lots of jobs to do driving tractors when I wasn't very old. In fact, about 4 or 5 years old, I would be tied on the seat of the tractor and just to steer.
But there was a lot of folk came to Brunies, wasn't there? There was a host of people came to Brunies, and a lot of people stayed at Brunies. I think that's why I've come to visit you, Les, is because I don't have much recollection of what my dad used to speak to me about. His younger days and the farming days, and of his parents. And I think you're right in what you said there, Les, because they were just living life. They didn't have time to speak about it. They just lived it.
Well, and they didn't speak about the past. I mean, you had 2 wars in the past, so I don't think they. I never heard them apart from the times I've told you they were speaking about the past. I didn't even hear very much about what happened at Brunies during the Second World War. Whether they were subject to blackouts or whatever, they must have been, because I remember there were lots of stories about, there was one farm in particular, and I won't mention who it was, but they were reckoned to be German sympathisers, because the word was that they left the lights on to guide the bombers to Aberdeen.
And I think this is so important, because what you're saying, Les, and the way, how you're thinking back, and what really made us who we are, and what made Britain how it is. I just think that says a lot, and it'll say a lot to the people of the future, because there was a sense of purpose, there was a sense of unity, there was a sense of comradeship and survival. And I actually think that sense of survival is kind of, I don't know, we need to get that back a wee bit.
If you just talk about the sort of major activity, which was going up to Caithness and buying sheep, buying young lambs and bringing them down and keeping them, selling them as gimmers. I mean, there was a big sense of community around that, because other people used to bring their floats and whatever from around, so they would all go, even though some of the farms weren't actually in that particular business. They weren't sort of buying up the best of the lambs in Caithness and bringing them down, but they all participated, and then they would all drive up and they would have a bit of a hoolie, and then they would sort of drive down through the night with a load of lambs. And it always made me wonder why so many people sort of went up who were not particularly in that business of actually rearing sheep from lambs to gimmers.
I know. And I think it was, looking back on it, it was a tremendous way of life. It really was. Because when I think about my dad, you know, and the way that he lived life, I mean, he lived for farming. He lived to farm, you know, for the land and for the animals. He did. And I think when he retired, he sort of lost his sense of purpose, because I think we all need a sense of purpose in life. So he kind of sat down for a few years until he got some sheep again, and then he got up and he got going, and he tended. Well, in fact, he made from a, a derelict piece of ground. He made a garden. And I think it was so nice, Les, because at the end of my dad's life, he was beginning to do, well, he was beginning to do what he'd done all his life, sustain the land and look after animals. And when Dad passed away, I was privileged enough to scatter the remaining ashes of Dad over at the little croft that Sandra, my sister, has. And this is a thing I think that we shouldn't just see ourselves as the here and now. Because as I scattered Dad's ashes over the grass and the landscape and the flowers, I actually felt Dad's presence. And it was, I will never ever forget that point where it's like that energy that he's created all through his life and his connection with the land and the elements. You know what? It was still present. And I was so happy with myself at that point, which would have, to a lot of people would have found quite difficult. But I actually found it quite easy because I know that I was releasing my dad to the very core of his existence. Oh.
Kind of interest, and I think it was basically true. I was told by a lot of people, but at some time during the past, if you were driving sheep or cattle or whatever, you were allowed to overnight them in anyone's pasture or field. And Freddie, at 14, was sent out with a huge flock of sheep for weeks on end, just moving them around, which is why, Freddie could tell out of a flock of 100 plus, he could actually identify each and every sheep. He could tell you, which sheep it was, although they all look pretty much the same to me. And I think it was probably that sort of prolonged period as a shepherd that he spent moving the sheep around Aberdeenshire.
And I think that everything is relevant in life. And I do think all this sense, it'll all come back again, Liz. You know, we have to sustain the the earth that we, you know, that keeps us here in this planet. And I think it'll all come back again, definitely. So they're not they're not gone, they're not lost. They're still there, Liz, our forefathers.